When we use a schedule network diagram to perform a forward pass and a backward pass, the goal is to determine whether we have any flexibility in our schedule. The flexibility in our schedule is also known as float. We are going to review each activity one by one to determine if that activity has flexibility with when it can start and finish. If you take a moment to review the activities, you will determine that some of them have differences between their early start and late start and their early finish and late finish dates. For instance, Activity H. The early start is 4, but the late start is 9. There is also a difference between the early finish and late finish dates. In order to determine the float, you subtract the early finish from the late finish. You can also subtract the early start from the late start. Either way, you will get the same answer. If you subtract the early finish of 5 from the late finish of 10, the answer is 5. Or if you subtract the early start of 4 from the late start of 9, you get the same answer, 5. Place 5 in the lower center of the activity to represent the float. So Activity H has 5 months of float. That is 5 months of flexibility. Activity H can start any time between April 1st and September 1st and can finish any time between the end of May and the end of October. Now that we know how to calculate the float, let's revisit the schedule network diagram. When the early start and early finish and late finish of an activity is the same, such as in Activity F, that means the activity has 0 float. There is no flexibility on when these activities can start and finish. They are locked in place. Take a moment to review the diagram and identify all activities with 0 float. You may pause the video at any time to determine the answer, and then resume the video when you're ready to hear the correct answer. Activities A, B, C, D, E, and F have 0 float. If this was your answer, great job! All of these activities have identical early start and early finish and late finish dates. This means that they have no flexibility on when they can start or finish. They are essentially locked in place. Now let's evaluate Activity J. Can you calculate the float? Feel free to pause the video at any time and resume when you're ready. If you said Activity J has a float of 2, you are correct. Now let's determine the floats for activities G and I. If you'd like more time to think about your answer, just pause the video and resume when you're ready. If you said Activity G has a float of 5 and Activity I has a float of 2, you are correct. Now you have calculated the float of all of the activities in your schedule network diagram. So what do we do with this information? First, let's take our 3 separate paths and place them on a calendar. Activity A is on all 3 paths. So are activities E and F. And remember those activities that had float? You can determine 5 months of float on Path 1 by counting the months where no activities are occurring. Path 2 has 2 months of float. Float is how long the activity can be delayed without affecting your project schedule. Since the float can be used anywhere along the path, it's called total float. Activities G and H can be delayed by 5 months along Path 1 without impacting the project schedule. And activities I and J can be delayed by 2 months along Path 2. This schedule flexibility, called total float, can be invaluable to you as a project manager when you are working with constraints such as the budget or availability of resources. Now that you have calculated the total float, let's consider a scenario where you can use it. Let's say that you have a conflict where the same resources are working on Activity G and Activity I. You don't have permission to pay overtime, and the people working on these activities are uniquely talented and skilled. In your opinion, they are not easily replaceable. Now that you have determined the total float, you may consider delaying both Activity G and Activity H to take place 2 months later. This will resolve your resource constraint and will still leave you plenty of available float on Path 1. So now you know how to calculate total float and how to use it when faced with a constraint such as a shortage of resources.